Hello YouTube! Okay, today we're going to be looking at the identity theory. The identity theory is the simplest and probably the most intuitive, obvious, materialist theory of the mind. Most of the lay people out there who are atheists and materialists probably accept a kind of identity theory. Now, with the demise of logical behaviourism in the mid-20th century, the identity theory was, for a fairly short period, the dominant theory in philosophy of mind. It has a few other names. It's also commonly known as reductive physicalism or type physicalism, for reasons that will become clear as we go through this video. Right, the identity theory was originally developed by U.T. Place, Herbert Feigl, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, but there's the name, and J.J.C. Smart. The basic idea is fairly simple. Mental states are simply brain states, or perhaps states of the central nervous system, but I'll speak simply of brains. Each type of mental state is numerically identical with a type of brain state. The example that's always cited in the philosophical literature is pain is the firing of C fibres. Now, this cannot be true for purely neurobiological reasons. We know that this particular claim that pain is the firing of C fibres, we know that that's false, because the production of pain is much more complicated than that. You have C fibres and A delta fibres. They're both types of axon that transmit pain signals to the brain. In the actual experience of pain, there's still more involved. But let's pretend, just to make this simple, that the firing of C fibres is indeed the neurological process associated with pain. Well, then the identity theorist says pain is nothing more or less than the firing of C fibres. Pain and the firing of C fibres both refer to the same thing. Pain is the firing of C fibres, in the same way that water is H2O. And the same analysis holds true of every other mental state. So we can say that for any type of mental state M, there is some type of brain state B such that M and B are numerically identical. M and B refer to the same thing. Okay then. Now from that, it should be clear why the identity theory is known as reductive physicalism. There have been, in the past, many cases where an older theory has been reduced to a new, more powerful theory. Consider, for example, states of matter, the four fundamental ones being solid, liquid, gas and plasma. We now know that all states of matter can be accounted for by appealing to different arrangements of particles. So states of matter have been reduced to different arrangements of particles. Solidity just is a particular kind of arrangement of particles. Another example is sound. Sound is a mechanical wave that propagates through a compressible medium. A vibration at the source creates a vibration in the surrounding medium, and this vibration is sound. To be high-pitched is simply for the wave to have a high frequency, say 500 Hertz or whatever. We have here examples where some older theory, some older framework is mirrored in a newer, more powerful theory. The older theory postulates certain entities related in certain ways, and this structure is replicated almost perfectly in some newer theory. But the newer theory is better. Perhaps it provides better explanations, perhaps it unifies phenomena that were once thought to be disparate, perhaps it allows us to make better predictions, there's more involved in it, perhaps it's better integrated with the rest of science, and so on. So, we can draw two conclusions from this. First, since the new theory works so well, it's probably correct. And second, since the older theory was also perfectly adequate, and since it mirrors some portion of the new theory, the older theory was probably also largely correct as far as it went, but incomplete. The older theory and the new theory describe the same things. The entities of the old theory exist in pretty much the way it described. Solidity exists, high-pitched sound exists, but once we see that solidity is just a particular arrangement of particles and high pitch is high frequency of a wave, well, we're given a far better understanding of solidity and high pitch. Okay, I hope that's reasonably simple and clear. So the identity theorist predicts that the same will occur with mental states. The old theory in question is our standard common sense psychology of pains, beliefs, desires, hopes, dreams, mental images, memories, tickles, itches, moods, and so on and so on. Now, in the philosophical literature, this theory, this framework, is sometimes called folk psychology. Folk psychology is the intuitive, pre-scientific theory that we use to understand ourselves and others. Anybody who can function in a basic way in our society will use folk psychology. Now, you might say that this isn't a theory in the strict sense of the term, but that's not really important. The point is that what we have in folk psychology are certain entities related in certain ways and put to certain uses. The identity theorist predicts that the theory of the brain developed by a mature neuroscience will mirror, at least in part, our common sense framework, our folk psychology. Pains exist, but they are the firing of C fibres. So we have a reduction of mental phenomena to physical brain state phenomena. That's why this is sometimes known as reductive physicalism. Okay then. Now I just want to note here an important contrast with behaviourism. We saw that behaviourism was about the meaning of mental terms. So according to the behaviourist, John is in pain means that John is exhibiting certain kinds of behaviour or has a disposition to exhibit certain kinds of behaviour. The identity theorist doesn't make any claim about meaning. Pain is the firing of C fibres, but this doesn't entail that the word pain means the firing of C fibres. So consider lightning is an electrostatic discharge, but the word lightning doesn't mean electrostatic discharge. You can know what lightning is and use the word perfectly well without having any idea what an electrostatic discharge is. Similarly with water and H2O, or cloud and massive liquid droplets, and countless other terms. Co-referential terms, terms which refer to the same thing, can have different meanings. And the point of this is that the identities, according to the identity theorist, will be empirical discoveries. For the behaviourist, the identities are simply a matter of conceptual analysis. The identity of mental states and behaviours are simply a matter of conceptual analysis. You can figure them out by, so to speak, sitting on an armchair and thinking about it. John is in pain means that John has a disposition to exhibit certain kinds of behaviour. That's a product of conceptual analysis, just like, for example, all bachelors are unmarried or all triangles have three sides. But now if you think of water is H2O, we had to do empirical investigation to find that out. We could never have reached that conclusion merely by reflecting on the meaning of the word water. So similarly, just which brain states our mental states are identical to will be discovered by empirical investigation. Right. I also want to note different types of the identity theory. I've said that the identity theorist holds that mental states are identical with brain states, but you may object. Well, hang on, the nervous system is distributed all around the body. When you stub your toe and feel pain, it's not just the brain that's involved in that experience of pain. The signals begin, obviously, at your toe. So why should we suppose that mental states are limited to the brain or to the central nervous system? Couldn't some of them be distributed around the body? Well, in fact, the identity theorist does not demand that mental states be limited in this way. Some identity theorists certainly say this. For example, I think David Armstrong defended this view, and the technical term for this view is central state materialism. But somebody who thinks that we have to include the peripheral nervous system, or even more than that, in our identities, is still an identity theorist. It's an empirical, not a philosophical question, exactly which parts of the body realise our mental states. We'll talk about mental states being realised in the brain as a convenient shorthand, and I'll continue to use that shorthand throughout this video. But just bear in mind that it's not necessarily limited to the brain. Right then, well that is the identity theory. That's the idea there. So why should we accept it? Why did people believe this? Well, first of all, in the video where we looked at substance dualism, we saw that one of the criticisms of dualism is that there are significant correlations between mental states and brain states. Scientific research on the mind has uncovered that various types of mental states correspond to types of brain states. I'm not going to rehearse all of this again. I talked about it in the substance dualism video, but obviously the identity theory provides a very neat explanation for these correlations. Of course, there are other explanations we might give for the correlations, but the identity theory is clearly the simplest explanation. The identity theory has parsimony in its favour. To say that if you have a correlation between some mental state and a brain state, to say that that mental state just is that brain state is a pretty good explanation for that correlation, a pretty neat explanation. We can appeal to the historical parallels as far as reductionism is concerned. In many cases, the world of common sense phenomena has been reduced by biology, chemistry, physics, whatever. The reduction of the mind by neuroscience would then be just one part of a long trend. We've already seen a couple of examples of this, how the common sense phenomena of states of matter, solidity, liquidity, gas, have all been reduced to arrangements of particles, and how the common sense phenomena of sound has been reduced to a wave propagating through a medium. Another powerful example is provided by electromagnetic theory. We can account for lightning, electrical currents, magnets, radio waves, visible light, and much more in terms of the attraction and repulsion of charged particles. So in general then, we know that the physical sciences explain a lot, and it's not so crazy to assume that this trend might continue. With that said, these days there is a great deal of debate in philosophy of science about the limits of reductionism in general. I'm not going to get into all that here. Suffice it to say that when the identity theory was popular, most physicalist philosophers were reductionists, but the tide has turned against that. One of the reasons the tide turned against reductionism was because of what are known as multiple realizability arguments, which we're actually going to look at later in this video. The point for now is just that these days, most philosophers of science accept that there are severe limits on reductionism. You can check out an intro to philosophy of science if you want to know more about this. I just wanted to note that this kind of appeal to historical parallels isn't so powerful anymore, because most philosophers of science feel that there are all sorts of areas where reductionism fails. Okay then. Now we should bear in mind that when taking a historical perspective on this, when the identity theory was suggested, it was clearly far more plausible than the primary alternatives. In the first two videos, I presented the dominant theories of mind prior to the identity theory: substance dualism and logical behaviourism. Substance dualism wasn't very appealing for the main reason that if we're going to be scientific, if we're physicalists, we don't want to countenance this weird non-physical mind stuff that somehow exists separately from everything else. In the 20th century, the empirical sciences had gained an enormous amount of respect, and substance dualism seemed like a relic from a darker era. That's not an argument against it, of course, but I'm just saying that it therefore wasn't very appealing to many philosophers. Logical behaviourism, on the other hand, had a host of technical problems, and in any case, the very idea that the mind could be nothing more than behaviour is obviously absurd and straightforwardly falsified by our own experiences. We all know that mental states are inner states. So it should be obvious then that for a physicalist, the identity theory is far preferable to these options. It also probably helped that by the mid-20th century, neuroscience, the scientific study of the brain itself, was beginning to emerge. Remember that one of the primary motivations of behaviourism was that they wanted to keep the study of the mind scientific. So they felt it had to be about behaviour because we simply can't access anything else. Nothing else is amenable to scientific investigation. But when you consider how far neuroscience has come, and that we actually can study the brain directly, the idea that only behaviour is amenable to scientific investigation looks very pessimistic. In fact, we can study the brain itself, and if anything is the intuitive source of mental states, at least as far as a materialist, a physicalist is concerned, it would be the brain. The brain is a perfectly intuitive place for mental states to occur. With that in mind, I hope you can see why the identity theory was and is, I guess, appealing. Nevertheless, it does have some problems. First, if you recall the first video, we saw that one of the motivations for dualism was that mental states appear to have many properties that physical states lack. Suppose you're looking at a red car. As long as your vision is functioning normally, this will cause you to experience an image of a particular colour, namely red. The trouble is that if I open up your brain as you're doing this and have a look in there, I won't see any patches of red in your brain. So how could your experience of red be a state of the brain? It doesn't seem even possible for your brain to have all of the properties that your experience does. Now, in fact, this objection is arguably based on a simple confusion. It's certainly an appealing objection, but it's arguably based on a simple confusion. Let's restate what's going on here. You are observing a red car, so you're having the experience of a red car. You're experiencing red. At the same time, some neuroscientist has opened up your skull and is observing your brain. He's observing the part of your brain that is the experience of the red car. Let's assume the identity theory is true, so that your experience of the red car just is a process in your brain. And the objector to the identity theory says, well, look, the properties of your experience are completely different to the properties of your brain states, so they can't be identical. But is this true? Are the properties of your experience different to the properties of your brain states? It's useful to look at this as a diagram. So here's the red car, and here's your brain and the experience inside. That's the experience there. And here's the scientist observing your brain, and that observation itself, of course, is an experience of the scientist. Right then, keeping this in mind, you are undergoing an experience of a red car. The scientist looking at your brain can see no red in there. But so what? An experience of a red object is not itself red. We must be careful not to confuse the properties of the experience with the properties of the object, like the red car, that are being experienced. To confuse the properties of the experience with the properties of the things that are being experienced is to commit what U.T. Place called the phenomenological fallacy. So, with that in mind then, what are the properties of your experience? Well, once you bear in mind this distinction, you can see that it's actually not so obvious just what the answer to this question is. It's not so obvious what the properties of your experience really are. It's not so obvious that the properties of your experience can't turn out to be neurological properties. Essentially, this objection to the identity theory assumes that, for example, redness is a property of your experience. But the identity theorist can insist that this is wrong. Redness is a property of the thing you're experiencing, so it's a property of the car, or it's a property of the light bouncing off the car, or whatever. But it isn't necessarily a property of your experience. So, you're experiencing a red car, the car is red, but this doesn't mean that your experience is red. The scientist is observing your brain, that is, the scientist is experiencing your experience. He doesn't observe any redness in your brain. Well, of course he doesn't. Your experience isn't red. What you are experiencing is red. An experience of an experience and an experience of a red car are clearly two different things. We should not expect them to be qualitatively similar. So, of course the scientist doesn't see any red in your brain. This point might be obscure, but it's important to grasp it, so I'm going to repeat the basic idea. You must not confuse the properties of an experience with the properties of the thing being experienced. And that's the case whether you're an identity theorist or a dualist or whatever. And to say that the identity theory is wrong because we don't observe patches of red in the brain is, quite arguably, is precisely to make this confusion. So I think the identity theorist has a reasonable response to this objection. Okay, now with all of that said, arguably there's a deeper problem here which this response doesn't really solve. Namely, can the identity theory account for qualia? There's something it's like to have a certain mental state. There's something it's like to see red. It's one thing to explain why we don't see patches of red when we look at somebody's brain, quite another to explain why there are any experiences of red at all. Why is there something it's like to see red? Can the identity theory account for qualia? Well, some people have felt that it can't. Some people have felt that physicalism in general can't, so I want to introduce two important objections to physicalist approaches such as the identity theory. First of all, there's the idea of a philosophical zombie, and this has been pushed most forcefully by David Chalmers, although he didn't actually originate the idea. It comes from a philosopher called Robert Kirk. A zombie is a being that is indistinguishable in certain ways from a normal human, except that it lacks conscious experience. It lacks qualia. There's nothing it is like to be a zombie. We can define different types of zombie. For example, a behavioural zombie is a being whose behaviour is completely indistinguishable from a human's, but it has no mental states. I think most people suspect that there could, at least in principle, be behavioural zombies. More controversial is the neurological zombie. And a neurological zombie is a being that is physiologically indistinguishable from a human, in particular a being whose brain is molecule for molecule identical to a human's, and yet that has no mental states. Now, for Chalmers, neurological zombies pose a problem for the identity theory. Chalmers grants that neurological zombies are not physically possible, so they couldn't exist in the actual world, but he does argue that they are logically possible. So a being which shares all of your neurological properties, but that has none of your mental properties, though this may not be possible in the actual world, is nevertheless not contradictory. There's no logical contradiction involved in the idea of such a being, so it's logically possible. It's very important to understand that Chalmers does not argue that we can have zombies in the actual world. All he argues is that there's nothing contradictory about them. So if you compare, for example, well, it's not possible in the actual world to have a creature that moves faster than light. Nevertheless, the idea of a creature that moves faster than light is not logically contradictory. It just can't exist given the laws of our world. According to Chalmers, zombies are in basically the same position. Further, if zombies are merely logically possible, then the identity theory is false. Why? Well, suppose it is possible for you to have a zombie counterpart. So there is a possible being that shares all of your neurological properties, but does not share any of your mental properties. If this is possible, then your mental properties cannot be your neurological properties, even if there may be absolutely strict correlations between them. Mental states cannot be identical to brain states if it's possible to have one without the other, because if A is B, it cannot be possible to have A without B, or vice versa. Obviously, for the extended argument against physicalism in general, if there is a possible being that shares all of your physical properties but none of your mental properties cannot be physical properties. Okay, so I hope you can see how that works. Now, there are two standard responses here. First, and most simply, we may say that the argument is simply circular. To say that it's possible for there to be a zombie, that is, a being whose brain is molecule for molecule identical to a human's, but that has no mental states, is just to say that the brain does not produce mental states. It's just to say that the identity theory is false. But that's precisely the point that the zombie argument is supposed to prove. You can't argue from the possibility of zombies to the falsity of the identity theory, because the possibility of zombies assumes the falsity of the identity theory. Essentially, in order to get the zombie argument off the ground, you have to assume the falsity of the identity theory. So clearly such an argument would be completely unpersuasive to any identity theorist. Second, we can deny that zombies are logically possible on the grounds that they're inconceivable or incoherent in some way. Now, the arguments here can get kind of complicated. I don't really want to go into them too much. I'll put up a couple of links to papers which argue that zombies are not conceivable in the in the description box. But here, just for example, is a quote from Dan Dennett, which nicely illustrates the conceivability problem. Supposing that by an act of stipulative imagination you can remove consciousness while leaving all cognitive systems intact is like supposing that by an act of stipulative imagination you can remove health while leaving all bodily functions and powers intact. Because, of course, the zombie is is exactly like us. Its brain is molecule for molecule identical to ours, so it can do everything we can do. It just isn't conscious. But for Dennett, that's like saying, you can take away the health while keeping everything else intact. And I must say, I do sort of share the skepticism about the conceivability of zombies. To me, asking me to imagine something that is molecule for molecule identical to me, but that has no mental states, I don't know, that seems a bit ridiculous. I'm not sure what I'm being asked to imagine, but then I'm a physicalist, so, I perhaps would say that. But with that said, I just want to note a problem with appeals to inconceivability in responding to this argument. The identity theory was always presented as being an empirical matter, not a logical matter, unlike behaviourism. We discover that pain is the firing of C fibres by empirical investigation, not by considering the meaning of the word pain. The identity theorists were happy to accept that we could have discovered that minds are not realised in brains. Maybe they're realised in stomachs, or maybe there's something completely non-physical. It could have been the case that it could have turned out that way. Obviously, it turned out, in fact, that minds are realised in brains, just as water turned out to be H2O. But isn't all this just to say that, logically, pain could have been something other than the firing of C fibres? Logically, pain could have been non-physical. And isn't that just to say that zombies are indeed logically possible? Well, something to think about there. Anyway, that's zombies. Next is Frank Jackson's knowledge argument, otherwise known as the Mary's Room thought experiment. So, imagine that a woman called Mary has spent her entire life living in a black and white room. Everything is black and white. There's no colour. Even her skin somehow has been made black and white, so she's never seen a colour. She's able to investigate the world, but only through a black and white television monitor. She has access to all sorts of books and computers and so on, but everything is black and white. Now, Mary has spent her life studying neurobiology. In particular, she's interested in the neurobiology of colour vision. And Jackson asks us to suppose that she knows all the physical, neurobiological information there is to know about colour and colour vision. She knows, down to the last detail, exactly what goes on in the brain when somebody sees a colour or uses colour terms. She knows all the physical information. Right, now imagine that she's released from her room. She's let out into the real, colourful world, and she sees a colour for the first time. The question is, when she sees a colour for the first time, does she learn anything new? Well, Jackson supposes that she does learn something new. She learns what it's like to see a colour. She learns what the experience of colour is like. When she sees a red object for the first time, she learns what it's like to see red. But remember, before her release, she knew all of the physical facts. So if, on being released, she learns something new, if she learns what it's like to see red, then what it's like to see red can't be a physical fact. Qualia cannot be brain states. The argument can be stated very simply. Prior to her release from the room, Mary had complete knowledge of all the physical facts of human colour vision. On leaving the room, Mary learned a new fact about human colour vision. Therefore, not all the facts about human colour vision are physical facts. Let me just clarify that the relevant thing that Mary lacks is knowledge of the experiences of others. Obviously, when Mary leaves the room, she will learn something new about her own experiences, simply because she'll have new experiences. She'll have the experience of seeing colours. No, the trouble is the experience of others. So, for example, she has complete knowledge of the physical facts of my colour vision, but, at least according to Jackson, she doesn't know what those experiences of colour are like for me. When she's released from the room, she learns that my experiences have a property that was obvious to me that was hidden from her. She learns what it's like for us when we see red, and she didn't know this before leaving the room. Now, this argument, if it's successful, establishes two things. First, it establishes that there are qualia. Second, that qualia are not states of the physical brain. At least some mental states cannot be identical to physical brain states. Now, there's a great deal of literature on the knowledge argument, but I want to mention a couple of responses. The simplest response is simply to deny the second premise and hold that Mary wouldn't actually learn anything new. This is one of the responses given by Dennett. Dennett argues that if Mary does in fact know all of the physical facts about colour vision, then she would know exactly what to expect on seeing red. She would know exactly how it is that our neurobiology gives rise to the experiences we have when we see red, and she would recognise red when she sees it. Indeed, we may wonder whether Mary's room simply begs the question against the physicalist. If Mary knows all the physical facts about colour vision, then she will only learn something new if there are non-physical facts about it. But that's precisely what the physicalist denies. And Dennett's response highlights one of the problems of trying to set up a thought experiment like this. Dennett gives his own twist on Mary's room. Imagine that one day her captors decide to trick her. So they present to her a bright blue banana, and this is the first time she's ever seen a colour. Now we're all expecting her to see it, and knowing that bananas are yellow, say incorrectly, "Wow, so that's what yellows look like." But she doesn't. She just says, "Hey, you tried to trick me. Bananas are yellow, but that one's blue." How does she do it? How does she know it was a trick? Well, she knows all the physical facts about colour vision. This kind of complete knowledge is, of course, totally preposterous. So it's no surprise that its consequences might be preposterous too. The thing is, when we talk about Mary's room, we think we understand it. But in fact, the very idea of somebody having complete knowledge of all the physical facts about colour vision is completely beyond our imagination. Maybe Mary would learn something new when she leaves the room. Maybe she wouldn't. But how can we possibly be in a position to say one way or the other? So Dennett challenges the very attempt to set up the thought experiment. But if we do take it seriously, what might we say? Well, one popular response is to grant that Mary does gain something, but she doesn't gain any new knowledge. So one approach to this is the acquaintance hypothesis, which was suggested by Earl Coney. Right, we must draw a distinction between propositional knowledge and acquaintance knowledge. To have propositional knowledge of P is simply to know that P. Propositional knowledge is, as its name implies, linguistic, propositional. To have acquaintance knowledge of P is to be familiar with P in the most direct way possible. Compare, for example, I know that Frank the dog sleeps in the hut because I've been reliably told by various people that Frank the dog sleeps in the hut. John knows the same thing. He knows that Frank the dog sleeps in the hut because he lives with Frank and frequently sees him sleep in the hut. Now, John may not have any propositional knowledge of this. For example, if John is another dog, arguably dogs can't have propositional knowledge since, obviously, dogs can't understand propositions. But John is acquainted with Frank's sleeping habits and knows them in this sense. Acquaintance knowledge involves direct interaction with the object of knowledge. How does this help us with Mary's room? Well, the physicalist can reason like this. Take some quail, for example, what it's like to see red. Well, then we can hold what it's like to see red is a physical property. Mary knows everything about what it's like to see red before her release. After her release, Mary becomes acquainted with what it's like to see red. And becoming acquainted with something simply involves having a certain kind of experience. It does not necessarily involve acquiring new propositional knowledge, since that knowledge can be acquired in other ways, for example by reading a book or whatever. Becoming acquainted with something just involves having a certain relation to the object of knowledge. So basically, we must be careful to distinguish what is known from how it is known. When Mary leaves the room, she comes to know the same fact in a different way. She comes to know what it's like to see red, but in a different way. She already knew what it was like to see red. She had propositional knowledge of what it was like to see red, but then she comes to be acquainted with what it's like to see red. Okay, well, so there's two responses to Mary's room. That's a very, very brief introduction. There's an enormous amount of literature on Mary's room. We haven't even scratched the surface there, but it'll do for now. Now, all this stuff about zombies and Mary's room, these are problems not just for the identity theory, but for any physicalist theory of mind. So I might revisit them in later videos. What I think is important to understand is that Zombies and Mary's Room illustrate a basic fact, which I've mentioned before, and that's that physicalists have trouble with qualia. They have trouble accounting for the fact that there's something it's like to be in a mental state. And that's a common sense objection. You can talk about Zombies and Mary's Room, but it comes down really to this kind of common sense objection that at the end of the day, it feels like something to have a mental state. It feels like something to see red, for example. And it's very difficult to see how you can accommodate that within any physicalist theory of mind. And the identity theory, obviously, being a physicalist theory of mind, it's very difficult to see how what it feels like to see red could be a brain state. Anyway, it's not just anti-physicalists who have objections to the identity theory. An objection that's available to anyone is this: how can the identity theory account for the unity of experience? One of the things that's so striking about consciousness is how everything is unified. You are conscious of many things at the same time. So suppose you see an orange, hear a train, and feel hungry. All of these things can happen at the same time, all happen at once. A single state of consciousness includes many simultaneous but distinct experiences. And the trouble is that this kind of unity cannot be found in the brain. There maybe was once a time when we hoped we'd find something like a neurobiological CPU, central processing unit, where everything in the brain all comes together, so to speak, in one place. But that unfortunately hasn't happened. Instead, what we've found are a load of fragmented subsystems. So if mental states are nothing more than brain states, where does the unity come from? Okay. Some states of the brain are mental states. Some states of the brain are not mental states. What is it about a state of the brain that makes it a mental state? The firing of C fibres is pain. The firing of, say, D fibres doesn't correspond to any mental state. So in virtue of what is one brain state mental and another non-mental? There must be some non-arbitrary way to draw the distinction, but the identity theory doesn't seem to provide any such way. Now, in itself, this is perhaps more of an unanswered question for the identity theory than an outright problem, but it becomes an outright problem when views were developed which could answer this question. So there are views that have been developed which can say what it is that makes one state mental and another non-mental, and we'll explore those views in later videos. So the failure of the identity theory to provide an answer to this question makes it look explanatorily impotent in comparison. It seems that we can have brain states without their corresponding mental states. Suppose we construct an exact replica of the C fibre system. We look at your C fibres and duplicate them down to the last molecule. However, we leave out everything else in your brain, so we're left with a system of C fibres and nothing else. Then we stimulate those disembodied C fibres. The question is, does this system experience pain? Well, if pain just is the firing of C fibres, then yes, it would do. But this seems rather implausible. Can you have just one mental state existing alone independently of other mental states? It's much more intuitive to say that in order to have mental states at all, you need to have a far more complex system, something like a whole brain, rather than just one part of it, where there can be many mental states going on at the same time. And conversely, it seems that we can have mental states without brain states. And this is the basis of what is without doubt the most powerful and influential objection to the identity theory, the multiple realizability objection, voiced most famously by Hilary Putnam. Multiple realizability is an extremely important concept in the philosophy of science in general, and I think many people see it as being pretty much a knockdown refutation of the identity theory. So, consider the fact that there are a very wide variety of creatures on this planet who seem to experience mental states. For example, pain. Humans, other primates, dogs, rodents, fish, reptiles, mollusks such as octopuses and so on. All of these seem to experience pain. Now, if all these creatures experience pain, and if pain is identical to a particular kind of brain state, then it follows that there must be some sort of brain state or neural state that all of these creatures share when they're in pain. And this seems extremely implausible. Certainly if there is some such state, we haven't found it yet. It seems instead that pain is multiply realizable. There are a variety of different neural states that can realize pain. The problem is compounded when we consider the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Isn't it at least in principle possible that there be Martians who are totally unlike us physiologically? Maybe their heads are made out of green blobs. Maybe they don't even have anything resembling heads, but they behave in very similar ways to us. They're very intelligent, they have language, art, complex society, and they also seem to experience pains. When you consider the vast size of the universe, the many opportunities for life to develop, it seems like there's a good chance that somewhere out there are creatures who are very different from us biologically, but very similar to us mentally. Now, if the identity theory is correct, this cannot be the case. The identity theory entails, to use a wonderful phrase, neuronal chauvinism. So the multiple realizability argument stated simply is this. All mental states are multiply realizable by distinct physical states. If a mental state is multiply realizable by a distinct physical state, it cannot be identical to any specific physical state. Therefore, no mental state is identical to any specific physical state. What makes this argument look so powerful is that it's perfectly in line with common sense. Most people are more than happy to accept that there might be aliens out there who have just the same mental states we do. Many people suspect that we might one day build conscious computers, genuine artificial intelligence. But clearly, the brain states of these beings would be totally unlike ours. In fact, they may not have brain states at all. And it's worth noting that mental states are not at all unique as far as multiple realizability is concerned. Consider, for example, clocks. Clocks are made up of physical stuff, but clocks do not reduce to one type of physical stuff. There are sundials, hourglasses, big wooden grandfather clocks, plastic digital watches, metal analog watches, and so on and so forth. So there is no unique physical state which is identical to the type clock. I'm sure you can come up with many of your own examples of this yourself. So that's multiple realizability. Now, there are responses to this. David Lewis, for example, pointed out that the reductionist can appeal to domain specificity. The point is that reductions are always carried out relative to a particular domain. And once you see this, the identity theorist can accommodate multiple realizability perfectly well. So the multiple realizability objection disappears. Consider, for example, the reduction of temperature. Pretty much everybody agrees that temperature has been successfully reduced. Strictly speaking, though, temperature, as far as we know, is not just one thing. Temperature in a gas is identical with average molecular kinetic energy. To say that a gas is hot is simply to say that it has high average molecular kinetic energy. Now, in a solid, where the movement of molecules is much more restrained, their energy switches between kinetic energy and potential energy, so temperature there is realized differently. In a plasma, there are no molecules, only subatomic particles, so temperature can have nothing to do with molecular energy. A total vacuum may have no particles, but it will have electromagnetic waves in it, and these give it what's known as a black body temperature. Temperature in a solid is one thing, temperature in a vacuum is something entirely different. Temperature is multiply realizable, but this multiple realizability has been no obstacle to the reduction of temperature. We just have to make sure that we specify the context, we specify the domain. Are we talking about a solid, a gas, a plasma, or what? And this gives us an easy way to deal with multiple realizability. Given multiple realizability, the identity theorist is committed to the following kinds of propositions. Types of mental state are identical to types of physical state. The physical realization of pain is C fibre firing. The physical realization of pain is such and such arrangement of green Martian blobs. Granted, these do look inconsistent, but the inconsistency is entirely superficial. We need only make explicit what is arguably tacitly asserted by each, namely that they are relative to particular domains. So we can alter 2 and 3 in this way. The physical realization of pain in humans is C fibre firing. The physical realization of pain in Martians is such and such arrangement of green Martian blobs. Once we make the distinction between pain in humans and pain in Martians, we can maintain the identity theory. This is obviously quite a powerful point. It's a good response. I'm not so sure that the appeal to domain specificity works in the case of minds, though. First, because once we're limited to talking merely about pain in humans and pain in Martians, it's questionable what can be said about pain simpliciter. The whole point of the multiple realizability objection is that our intuition that human pain and Martian pain are the same thing. They're the same kind of pain. Pain said of humans means just the same as pain said of Martians. It seems that, at least for the domain specificity response to work, we'd have to deny this. Or at least we could not be justified in asserting it. So to continue the analogy with temperature, we can indeed say that temperature in a vacuum, strictly speaking, isn't the same thing as temperature in a gas. The word temperature, it turns out, picks out various different things. But there's a strong intuition that mental states really could be the same, despite the different physical realization. Okay, so that's one problem with domain specificity. A more serious problem with domain specificity, at least with the domain specificity response, is that it arguably underestimates how radical multiple realizability is. So far we've been comparing humans and Martians, or humans and computers. But in fact, multiple realizability of mental states occurs even within humans. There's now quite a lot of literature, for example, on neuroplasticity, which is essentially just the ability of the brain to change over time. For example, if the brain is damaged, functions can be transferred to a different area. Functions from the damaged area can be transferred to an area that isn't damaged. The most striking example of this can be seen with a rare surgical procedure known as a hemispherectomy. And this involves removing a whole hemisphere of the brain. Literally half the brain is removed. This surgery is performed in cases of extreme epilepsy, where the epilepsy is localized to one hemisphere of the brain. But what's important for our purposes is that people who've had this operation can live a pretty much normal life with very little deficiency of their cognitive abilities. The functions that were lost with the removal of one hemisphere can be relearned in the surviving one. This is especially true with children, largely because neuroplasticity is greater in children. What this means is that there are people out there with half a brain, and they may be just as capable as you or me. Now obviously the physical realization of mental states and mental capacities in a person who's had a hemispherectomy is going to be very different to the realization in you or me. In fact, we don't need to consider anything so unusual as this. Earlier, we saw the neural correlation argument in support of the identity theory, but I think this argument can be turned against it. Okay, there are some correlations between mental states and brain states, but is it plausible to suppose that, for example, the belief that snow is white has a particular neural correlate, or the mental image of a purple elephant, or a desire to eat chocolate ice cream? Maybe each of these is associated with a particular kind of brain state. Perhaps we can't yet rule that out. But I don't think it's a very plausible suggestion. It seems much more likely that very specific mental states such as these are realised in different ways in different people. And if this is right, then if we want to maintain the domain specificity line, we're going to be driven to saying things like this. The physical realisation of pain in Mark is X, the physical realisation of pain in Jackson is Y, the physical realisation of pain in Franz is Z, and so on. And every other mental state would have a similar list. But clearly this is an astonishingly weak kind of identity theory. As far as reductions go, it's pretty much useless. And this leads us neatly to a point with which I wish to end this video. In response to multiple realisability, physicalists drew on the type-token distinction. Okay, look at this. Vol, vol, vol. How many words have I written there? Well, obviously it depends on precisely what it is we're counting. There's one type of word. There's a sense in which we can say that each of these words is the same. They're qualitatively identical, but they're not numerically identical. There are 3 tokens of the type. So there's one type and 3 tokens. We can apply this distinction to mental states. Take the belief that snow is white. we can say both Frank and John have the belief that snow is white. Both Frank and John believe that snow is white. How many mental states are there here? Well, there's one type of mental state, the belief that snow is white, and two tokens of the type, Frank's belief that snow is white and John's belief that snow is white. And we can say the same about brain states. If both Frank and John's C fibres are firing, we have one type of brain state, the firing of C fibres, and two tokens of the type. So we can distinguish two different views in philosophy of mind using this type-token distinction. Type identity theory is the claim that each type of mental state is identical with a type of physical state. For example, pain is identical with the firing of C fibres. This is the view we've been looking at in this video. Token identity theory is the claim that each token mental state is identical with a token physical state. In John, a particular pain is identical with a particular brain process, say C fibres firing. Frank has the same type of pain, but it's identical with a very different brain process, say D fibres firing. Islier and Sorg, the Martians, also have the same type of pain, but they don't have brains at all, so in them it's identical to a green blob process. Clearly, token identity theory is entirely compatible with multiple realizability. All a token identity theorist is committed to saying is that the mental states are physical states in one form or another. Obviously, the big question for a token identity theorist is, if mental states come in all these disparate forms, in virtue of what is one physical state mental and another non-mental? What exactly is it that makes it right to say that John, Frank, Islier and Sorg are all in pain? This is a very important question, but token identity is not the identity theory as far as this video is concerned. It's a separate view. When philosophers talk about the identity theory, it's generally used to refer to the type identity theory, which I've explained in this video. Token identity comes in many forms, and we'll examine some of those forms in later videos, and maybe we'll get an answer to this important question. But I think that's enough for today. I hope it's been helpful, so thank you for watching. Goodbye.